Hi Cambridge class, so I have some very exciting news. I am taking you through into Oxford class next year. Now I am very excited about this and I feel so lucky to be able to do this because we've had such a fantastic year this year and I hope we can have another fantastic year next year too. Now, you may be wondering what there is to be excited about in Year 6. So here is a bit of an overview of the autumn term. So the first thing that we are going to be doing is we're going to be going to Bushcraft. And lots of you have decided that you want to go to Bushcraft, which is fantastic. Whilst there, you will be able to do things like making dens and maybe even sleep under the stars. So our topic in autumn term will be looking at Mexico. So we will be looking at deserts during that topic. We will be looking at a famous artist in that topic and recreating some of her own work using our own portraits. And we will also be looking at something called Dia de los Muertos. So I'm not going to tell you what that means at the minute because I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I'm sure you will enjoy it. Now, we are staying in the same classroom next year, so that means that you already know where to go. However, I am hoping that next year we can rearrange our tables so that they are a bit more user-friendly. We are now going to look at a story called The Accidental Prime Minister. Now we're not going to read the full story because it is rather long, so we're just going to look at the first few pages and then we can read the rest of the story during our lessons for the rest of the half term. Now this story is one of my favourite stories and I think the themes that run through this story might come in handy for us to remember about our journey through to Year 6. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the story so that you know what to expect. So the story is about a 12-year-old boy called Joe who hears that the Prime Minister is going to come to his school for a public event, and he knows that it's the only opportunity that he might have to talk with someone with a real influence because his beloved park is going to be shut down. Now, his mum works at this park, so that means that she would be out of a job, and also the rest of the children would be out of a place to play. He is full of good ideas of how to make things better, and everybody else agrees with him, except the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to care, which causes Joe to become quite unkind. And before he knows it, because everybody else agrees with him, Joe becomes the new Prime Minister. But he soon realises that delivering on all the promises isn't as easy as he first thought, and he needs to learn that being Prime Minister isn't all about riding around in comfortable cars and signing autographs. The Accidental Prime Minister. Chapter 1. I don't like Mondays. Bleep! There are many awful sounds in this world. Fingernails down the blackboard, mum singing the theme tune to Match of the Day in the shower, bagpipes being played badly, in fact bagpipes being played brilliantly as well, but there are none worse than the sound of an alarm clock early on a Monday. Why are mornings so early? Joe muttered to himself, before trying to grab his alarm clock, missing it and falling out of bed. This was not uncommon for Joe. He often fell, even when no falling was required. He was one of life's great fallers. He fell into rooms, he fell out of them again. He even managed the almost impossible task of falling upstairs, which, let me tell you, is no mean feat. Joe's life was a constant battle with gravity, one in which gravity clearly had the upper hand. He picked himself up from the bedroom floor and set about trying to get dressed without opening his eyes. It was a trick that he tried to help fool his sleepy head that he was still in bed. The downside was it made putting pants on very tricky indeed. Up to that point, putting on underwear with his eyes shut was as close to living on the edge as Joe's life got. Joe lived in a tiny house in London with his mum. Dad had disappeared before Joe was born and he didn't have any brothers or sisters. The nearest he came to having a sibling was the time when a cat from down the street came to stay for 10 days last year. Other than Mr. Tiddles, it had only ever been the two of them. Joe's mum was a park warden, and that meant she spent most of her days making sure that the flowers were looked after and no dogs were doing their doings where they shouldn't. It was a job she loved, and Joe loved her working there too. Joe's house didn't have a garden, just a tiny yard, the sort of place where you'd graze your knee if you fell over, which, as you know, is something Joe did a lot. So the park always felt like his and Mum's garden. When Mum wasn't in the park, pruning flowers and shouting at dog owners, she was in the kitchen cooking. It was her thing. She would stop off at the shops and buy the bags of food that no one else wanted, which she'd use for inspiration in the kitchen, thinking up extraordinarily weird recipes with which to to impress, Jo. Jo knew that it was really because money was sometimes tight, but it meant that meal times were never dull. Who can forget the cheese salad with onion gravy or the plum tandoori crumble? Apart from the odd meal, Jo's life was pretty unremarkable. Apart from ring! Just then, the doorbell rang. "Let me in! It's an emergency!" came the exasperated cry from the other side. Jo's mum opened the door and there stood AJ, Jo's oldest and best friend. "What is it, AJ?" Jo's mum said, sounding panic-stricken. "I smell your world-famous fresh tea and toast with sour rhubarb jam, Mrs. P, and I need a fix." AJ grinned and waggled an eyebrow up and down. AJ was the only person in the world who found Jo's mum's cooking not only edible but enjoyable too. Then again, AJ did once eat a fingerful of his own earwax in geography for a bet, so it's fair to say he probably hasn't got the most sophisticated palate. "Oh, AJ, doesn't your mother feed you?" Jo's mum asked, rolling her eyes, but she was well used to AJ's TARDIS-like stomach. "Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, Mrs. P. That's why I make it my business to have as many as possible. Got any pork pies?" AJ grinned, pushing past her in the direction of the breakfast table. "You know I hate those things, AJ," Mum said, shaking her head. "I think it's the jelly. It makes me squeamish." AJ and Jo had been best friends since they were at nursery when they found out they had the same birthday. And let me tell you, when you're 3, that sort of thing blows your mind, which pretty much means you're destined to be bestest friends for life. If it wasn't for AJ, school would be nothing more than a yawn factory. AJ was the sort of boy who made even the dullest, dreariest things in life seem a giggle. He was always scheming, always thinking of a plan to make the teacher laugh, or trying to figure out how they were both going to become millionaires by next Tuesday. These plans nearly always involved Jo and nearly always failed, but that was half the fun. AJ was just about to tuck into his tea and toast dripping in sour rhubarb jam when there was a loud clatter from the letterbox as an important-looking brown envelope landed on the mat. "Bit early for the post, isn't it?" Mum said. "Ooh, it says special delivery." She opened it and unfolded the letter. Jo knew instantly that something was wrong. He could see it on Mum's face. "What is it, Mum?" Jo asked. "Yeah, Mrs. P, what's happened?" asked AJ too. "It's the park. They've shut it down." For a second, no one said a word. Jo and AJ looked at each other, then back at Jo's mum. Her face was pale, her jaw dropped open. She stared at the letter, her eyes watery and ready to spill over with tears. "Shut the park?" Jo said furiously. "They can't do that. It's the park." "Yeah, everyone loves that place," AJ joined in. "You boys best get to school, or you'll be late," said Mum, her voice all shaky. "But what about—" Jo started to say. "You leave that to me. I don't want you worrying." Mum tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. If she was trying to reassure Jo, it wasn't working. He knew his mum needed that job. How else was she supposed to put sweet and sour spaghetti on the table? "Don't worry, Mum. I'll think of something." Jo's mum just nodded, turning away to wipe her eyes. Jo and AJ grabbed their bags and reluctantly headed out of the door. Neither of them said anything for what seemed like ages. "You all right, man?" AJ asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know. I can't believe they've closed the park. Why?" Jo said in disbelief. "Dunno," AJ shrugged. "But I know a man who might," he said, pointing down the road. They saw a man in the distance. He had a ladder and toolbox and was busy hammering a sign into the park gates. This made Jo's blood boil. If Mum had been there, she would have given him what for. No one hammers anything into anything without her say-so first. "Oi!" AJ yelled. "What are you doing?" Jo read the sign. "Under development." "What's going on?" Jo asked. "Why have you closed the park?" The man stopped what he was doing and shrugged. "They don't tell me anything. I'm just the bloke who hammers things." Joe read the rest of the sign. Under development. This notice hereby declares that St George's Park is closed with immediate effect and that from the 1st of July, this park will be redeveloped and a new block of luxury flats will be built. Department of Progress. Underneath the notice was a drawing of a posh building, tall and made of glass. It had pictures of smiling people chatting and drinking coffee outside. Joe and AJ looked through the park gates and could already see diggers moving in, ready to tear the playground apart. This can't be happening, Joe muttered, blinking back the tears. This was the place where he and AJ hung out, where they used to plot how they were going to become mega rich and plan what to do if the world got taken over by zombies. This was the place where Joe and AJ used to play football, or rather where AJ would kick the ball and Joe would try and get out of the way of it before it hit him in the face. And now it was going to be turned into flats. Why wasn't anyone stopping this? Hello? Anything I can do? Joe turned to see a policeman standing by the sign and looking down at Joe and AJ. Yes, Joe gasped. Stop this man from closing the park. Yes, officer, AJ joined in. Arrest this man. Eh? Said the man, hammering. What did I do? You're closing the park, AJ yelled at him. I told you, I'm just the bloke who does the hammering. I'm not closing anything. Just then, a group of police motorcycle outriders whizzed past, sirens screaming and lights flashing as they went. It was like something from a movie, only it was happening in their street. What on earth? The man on the ladder said. Nearly, but rather disappointingly, not falling off. Ooh, said AJ, glaring wide-eyed at the convoy of flashing blue lights and sirens. Do you think there's been a bank robbery? Or maybe aliens have landed? Oh, I hope it's an alien invasion, said Joe. We definitely get the day off school for that. It's the Prime Minister, said the policeman. He's visiting here today, and I'm here as backup. You mean you're not here to stop them closing the park? Joe said. Oh no, looks like the park's had it, he said, peering at the sign. Shame, I used to play here as a kid. Where is the Prime Minister visiting? Joe asked. A school, I think. Yes, it's definitely a school. There was only one school down that end of the road, Joe and AJ's school. AJ and Joe looked at each other, and without saying a word, they grabbed their bags and ran. Well, AJ ran. Joe tripped over his laces. I bet he can save the park, Joe yelled, picking himself up. Bound to, AJ grinned. At the very least, we'll probably get out of double algebra. This is even better than the time that dog came in the playground and pooed on the netball court, yelled Joe. Well, I don't know. That was a pretty special day, said AJ seriously. But it's definitely up there. By the time AJ and Joe got to the school, there was a huge crowd already there of excited schoolchildren, policemen, TV reporters and cross-looking members of the public. There, at the front of the crowd, stood the headmaster, Mr. Brooks. AJ nudged Joe. Mr. Brooks looks, well, really weird. Has he combed his hair differently? Mr. Brooks had indeed combed his hair, but that wasn't it. Suddenly, Joe figured it out. I know. He's smiling. Oh yeah, AJ realised. It's really creepy, isn't it? What's going on, Mr. Brooks? Said Joe. Mr. Brooks sighed impatiently. Oh no, not you two. I warn you, any mischief and you'll be for the high jump. Is the Prime Minister coming, sir? AJ asked, looking at the big black limo that had just pulled up behind the police motorcycles. Yes, it was supposed to be a secret, you know, for security reasons, seeing as how he's pretty much hated by most people these days. But some buffoon must have told the papers. I mean, look at all these cameras, he said, suddenly grinning and running a licked finger over one eyebrow. The doors of the black limo opened and out stepped a stout man in a mud-coloured suit. He had a red, wobbly face in the middle of which sat a bulbous nose, like a cherry on a particularly disgusting trifle. The man dabbed his sweaty face with a hanky and attempted to flatten his wispy hair with a clammy hand. The man in question was Percival T. Ducombe. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain and, it's fair to say, one of the most disliked men in the land. He was the kind of man who would not only sell his grandmother for a quick buck, but he'd also try to sell your grandmother too. In fact, if you've got a moment, I suggest you give her a quick ring and tell her not to answer the door to any trifle-faced Prime Ministers. Percival T. Duckham was also one of the rudest men you're ever likely to meet. He liked to shout at people. In fact, shouting was his most favourite thing in the world. He'd shout in the morning at breakfast to his poor wife and pale children. Then he'd have a bath and shout a bit in there. Then he'd get dressed and shout about how he couldn't find his socks. Then he'd go to work and shout until lunch, before it all got too much and he had to have a nap until it was home time. You may well say, surely he can't be that bad. Surely someone must like him. I mean, he did manage to become Prime Minister after all. Well, the simple truth is, the man he was up against was even more loathsome. I know, it's hard to believe. But let me tell you about Melvin Thwick, a man so obnoxious that if you ever got to meet him, it would take you all your strength not to vomit through your nose just to be in the same room as him. He had greasy hair, terrible breath, and dandruff so bad you'd think winter had come early by looking at the state of his shoulders. He picked his nose with all the eagerness and desperation of a man looking for loose change down the back of a sofa. When he spoke, he sounded like farts. He had the charm and manners of a drunk pig feeding at the trough. He hated pretty much anyone and everything, and he made no secret of trying to hide it, so it's not hard to see why he chose a career in politics. So there you have it. That's the very short story of Percival D. Duckham's rise to power. He just happened to find an opponent that was even more repulsive than him. So anyway, where were we? Oh yes, Percival T. Duckham emerged from the car. He waved and smiled at the crowds, even though no one was cheering him. In fact, they were booing him. Joe looked round and saw that quite a mob had gathered. The more Percival smiled, the more they shouted and wailed at him. "Resign, you lump!" one angry lady yelled. "You're a crook!" another man shouted. This just seemed to whip the reporters and cameramen into more of a frenzy. Percival T. Duckham ignored the crowd and headed for Mr. Brooks. "What a marvellous school you have here," he said. "Thank you. Would you like to meet some of the children?" Mr. Brooks replied eagerly. "God, no. It's bad enough that I have to spend time with my own." Joe pushed his way to the front of the crowd. This was his chance. He figured that if he just explained about the park to the Prime Minister, he would fix it. I mean, that's what Prime Ministers do, isn't it? They fix things. Mr. Prime Minister, sir, can I ask you a question?" Joe asked timidly. "Ew!" the PM shrieked. "Get away from me, you horrible creature!" "I just wanted to ask you a question. It's about our park." "You just wanted to fart a question about a park?" the Prime Minister asked. "Speak up, boy." "No, I wanted to ask a question about the park. Our park has been closed down and they're going to build a big shiny tower on it." By now, everyone was listening. Even Mr. Brooks was staring at Joe, a mixture of bewilderment and anger on his face. Mostly anger, maybe 5% bewilderment. Joe wasn't used to people actually listening to him. He normally liked to sit quietly and let AJ take the lead, but he knew this could be his only chance to save his mum's job. "Ah," the Prime Minister said, smiling. "At last a sensible question. Yes, it's true. We have closed down the grotty old park and built a shiny new tower. That's what this government is all about, building shiny new things. No need to thank me, Sonny Jim." Right, well, I don't think that Joe would have been very happy with that decision, and I don't think that the Prime Minister seems a very nice person. But Joe has showed a lot of bravery there because he's normally quite shy and lets AJ do the talking. He's also shown quite a lot of determination, hasn't he? Because he doesn't want the park to close. So the reason why I chose this book is because there are many key themes that link to our class. So the little boy in the book shows great friendship. He doesn't want the playground to be destroyed because he wants a place for all his friends to play. He also shows great determination and perseverance because even though the Prime Minister wouldn't listen to him when he wanted to save the park, he carried on, he didn't give up. He first asked the person who was putting the sign up to stop, and then he went to speak to the Prime Minister. So he showed real determination and a desire to want that park to stay open. He also wanted his mum to still be in a job, didn't he? And the last quality is ownership. So he realised eventually that it was too hard becoming Prime Minister and that actually not everybody would be happy with his decisions. So he had to make sure that he owned his mistakes and made them right again. So, these are some of the qualities that I hope that we can demonstrate next year in Year 6. We need to make sure that we are good friends to each other and that we show determination and perseverance in order to succeed